everyone, and welcome to this month's synth tutorial with Computer Music Magazine. And this month we're going to be creating a fantastic new bass patch which we call Go Getta Bass. Now the clue, as they say, is in the name, and this is the kind of sound that you would hear on a track by artists such as Calvin Harris or David Guetta. And in fact, we've styled this sound to be very similar to the sound used on the Getta track Crazy What Love Can Do. So let's dive right in. First thing to do, load up your favourite DAW and load in an instance of the Zebra CM plugin. Now before we get started creating our sound, we would advise that you go to the master volume pot, which you'll find on the far bottom right hand side, and you drag that pot value to a 12 o'clock position. It's also worth reminding you that anytime you alter the value on any one of the pots on screen, you'll see a value appear in the menu display at the top. So in the case of the master volume control here, you can see that we're selecting a value of 50. Let's now begin by making the sound itself, and we're going to start by visiting oscillator number 1 on the left hand side here. We're going to start with a waveform which is a hybrid between a square wave and a triangle wave, and we get this by clicking and holding on the wave icon, dragging the mouse upwards, and keeping half an eye on the display at the top. We want a value of 2.60. We also want to increase the volume of the oscillator, and we do this by moving to the volume control which is right next door and changing that to a value of 130. Staying within the oscillator 1 section, we're now going to visit the wave pot which we have just below the wave icon, and in fact we're going to be modulating the wave icon, and we do this by assigning envelope number 2 to the user assignable pot which is directly below. So we click and hold on the user definable drop down menu which is just below the pot and make sure we have env2 selected. Then we need to visit the pot itself and drag that down to a value of -1.1. What we've actually done here is told envelope 2, which is in the center here, to modulate the waveform of oscillator number 1. We'll be coming back to that. Now we're going to make some similar alterations to oscillator number 2. So moving into the oscillator 2 section, we start with the waveform, and we're going to change our waveform here to a value of 2.40. You can see it's very similar to the waveform that we've selected on oscillator 1, but there's just a little bit of difference there, which will just give us a slightly different colour. We also need to adjust the volume of oscillator 2, so moving to the volume pot for oscillator 2, we're going to set this to a value of 74. Oscillator number 2 is actually going to be acting as a form of sub-oscillator, so in order to make this happen, we need to detune the oscillator by 1 octave. In the language of semitones, that equates to -12, so clicking on the tune button at the top here, we're going to drag that down so that the upper display reads -12. You should now be hearing a sound like this. And as you can hear, the sound is quite thick, but it could also use a little bit of detuning. So we're going to go to the detune pot, which is also in the oscillator 2 section, and just nudge that down by 1 increment so it reads -1. That should then be enough to just create a slightly more palatable texture. It's subtle, but it does a job. So having dealt with the upfront element of our sound, we now need to move to the filter section. And we're going to be using the low pass 12 dB filter, which you can select from the filter drop-down. At the moment, the sound is incredibly bright, and we're going to alter that by changing our cutoff pot to a value of 62. This should immediately limit the brightness so that when you hear it now, it should sound quite a bit duller. Next, we're going to induce a degree of modulation, also from envelope 2, but toward the cutoff of the filter. In order to do this, we're going to go to the user definable pot, which is at the bottom of the filter section. We're going to click and check that we've got envelope 2 selected, and then on the pot itself, we're going to set that to a value of 45. Having altered the tonal elements related to this sound, we're now going to go to the envelope sections. Envelope 1 controls the amplitude of our sound, and we need to make the following settings. We set the attack phase to a 0, we set decay to a value of 50, we select sustain to a value of 80, and we select the released phase to a value of 20. Then we move to the envelope 2 section, and envelope 2 is going to be modulating both the wave of oscillator 1 and also the cutoff frequency of the filter. So the settings we need here are the attack phase set to 0, the decay phase set to 37, the sustained phase set to 0, and finally the release phase set to a value of 22. This should mean that we get a nice sustain, but with a nice click up front, which is being caused by both our filter and a little bit of modulation to the wave. So don't forget, when you're working with a sound like this, because we have quite a bit of punch up front, which is being caused by envelope 2, we need to make sure that we've got some compression in play. Today we're using a FET style compressor, and we're using the Arturia Comp FET 76, which you can buy individually, or you can just make do with one of the compressors that you have within your DAW. If you have the option, try and go for something which is styled towards a FET, because it tends to introduce some really nice colour in the bottom end, which will be particularly good for bass sounds. And don't forget that whilst your sound itself might be really impressive, a little bit of EQ will probably go a long way to just helping it even further. And we've chosen to put in a little hump between the frequencies of roughly 40 Hz and 200 Hz. That'll help bring out some of those really warm bottom end textures and frequencies. So that's it for this month. Don't forget to go get a bass.